Okay. Okay, just a minute for everyone to just slowly load in. 51, 53, 60, 70. Okay, I think it's more or less stop. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining once again another session organized and hosted by the Blockchain Association of Singapore. I'm Kevin, the Secretary of Blockchain Association of Singapore. Very honored today to host this particular event on NFT. So again, this is one of the series of panels that started off with the first panel almost a month ago on NFT. It will be a continuous series of other panels as well. We have done 2 so far. This is the 3rd one. But as promised, right, I think there's a lot of interest in the areas of regulatory compliance and legality on NFT. So that's where we are today, right? We're going to do this today. So we have gotten one of the top 3 experts in Singapore, right? I mean, the top few experts in Singapore to actually talk about this today. We have people from law firms, we have people from the compliance space and all that. And obviously some of them are definitely very familiar to you. So really honorable to have the experts over here today to share their time to talk about this particular very interesting and hot topic on NFTs. And I think right now there's a lot of webinars going on about NFTs, but I think it's definitely not covered enough in the area of in terms of legal, in terms of compliance, especially in like very interesting space about intellectual property rights and things, stuff like that. We will cover all these topics today. So Jiahui, next slide, please. So without further ado, let me introduce you to first and foremost Tan Leng from JurisAsia with us today. We have Rajesh Sreenivasan from Rajah and Tann, and of course Nizam Ismail from Ethikom, as well. He heads up the regulatory and compliance subcommittee in Blockchain Association of Singapore. Okay, so without further ado, I shall just hand it over to Nizam.
Hi, thanks Kevin, and very warm welcome everyone to this afternoon session hosted by the BS. I think as you might be familiar, we try to make this as interactive and fun as possible. So if you have any questions along the way, you can drop those questions in the Q&A box right at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Going on to actually the next slide, Chia-Hui, we typically kick off with a poll to get everybody warmed up. And really, the question is, what is your interest in NFT? So we're going to launch the poll very shortly. And yep. So the options are, I have bought some. Yeah, I'm actually a whale. I've read about them. And I'm just a little bit curious about them. But actually, I'm planning to issue an NFT. So which one are you? I'm going to actually vote on this as well.
Okay, good. This time around, we can see the percentage. I think that's a new function.
We finally paid the subscription for this.
Could be. Last time I could probably just guess how much, probably to stop the poll. But right now, I think as long as we get to a certain percentage. Okay, I think it stopped. Okay, at least I can see. So end the poll. Okay, majority have read about them. Probably from the news, and I think the Straits Times and as well as the mainstream media, even on the TV, has covered that substantially. Almost every other week I saw articles from the mainstream media, not just locally in Singapore, but overseas. So yeah, I think everyone will have read about them.
Okay, so not quite a one-on-one session. I think some people, majority of people have some knowledge about this, but yet, quite a sizable population who are curious about this. Next slide, please. So we thought of segmentizing the issues for discussion. We sort of prepared a slide to help guide the areas of discussion. But at any point in time, if you have any questions or any of the fellow panel members, please feel free to jump in and chime in with your comments. So obviously, the number one question is it legal? Can I do so? Do I need a license? So we'll talk a bit about that, in the specific context of the Payment Services Act. The next issue is AML and CFT, right? Anything that's blockchain related, AML and CFT comes front and center. So what are the AML CFT implications? And then intellectual property issues, very much relevant when it comes to NFTs, because at the core of it, the thing that is of value is typically an intellectual property. We're going to talk about fractionalization, what kind of rights you're getting in terms of the tokens. Of course, there's fraud, as with anything that's of value, there's always a dark side to it. How do you mitigate against fraud? What are the kind of fraud indicators which you look out for? Next, data privacy in the Singapore's context, PDPA or elsewhere. We've got all the other legislation governing data privacy. And lastly, but not insignificant, the issue of censorship and public interest issues as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, next, first off, the regulatory treatment of NFTs. Next slide, please. Okay, just a bit of a recap. So I'll just touch on this very quickly, and would also like to invite the other panel members to jump in at any point in time. Remember that since last year, we've got the Payment Services Act, and under the Payment Services Act, there are 7 licensable activities. The one that's relevant for today's discussion is number 6, which is digital payment tokens services. Currently, the PSA regulates the activities of dealing. So if you sell cryptocurrencies, I'm quite sure the exchanges are pretty busy right now with the way that crypto prices are happening over the last couple of weeks. So whether it's OTC or you set up a crypto exchange, you need a license. And then the PS Amendment Act also introduces, these other activities: transfer of DPTs, custodial wallets for DPTs, facilitating exchange of DPTs without possession. But at the core of it, the issue is it a DPT? Because if it's a DPT, then and you are conducting any of these activities caught in the box number 6, you will need a license issued by the MAS. So next slide, please. So, we need, therefore, to examine whether NFTs fall within the definition of digital payment tokens. So this is an extract from section 2 of the PSA, the interpretation section. I'm sorry for the legalese, but I think it's important that we go through this. So a DPT means any digital representation of value, other than an excluded digital representation of value. There's some exemptions, which are not really relevant for today's discussion. So it's expressed as a unit. It is not denominated in any currency and not pegged by its issuer to any currency. So it's not legal tender. It is or is intended to be a medium of exchange accepted by the public or a section of the public as payment for goods or services, or to discharge a debt. So there's something of value, you can buy goods or services with it. And that's quite critical when you talk about NFTs. It can be stored, traded, or transferred electronically. And E is a catch-all provision that the MES could prescribe anything going forward. So going on to the next slide. So therefore, the question is whether NFTs are DPTs when you look at the definition that we spoke about. So the typical NFT characteristics is typically a unique smart contract on a distributed ledger. It is associated with something of value, art, Choon Leng's photographs, multimedia, music that I create in the office, video, other IP rights. It's non-fungible, right? So unlike BTC or ETH, so you could pay for Rajesh's legal fees using BTC. I'm not sure whether you can do that, but we do take BTC or ETH. So an NFT is non-fungible, right? It's associated with a specific artwork or a piece of music, and it's typically not interchangeable with other assets. So that's quite important. And remember the definition that in essence, a DPT is meant to be a medium of exchange for goods or services. But that's not the case for NFTs typically. But of course, you can create any NFT, so you need to actually look at the underlying economics or the value of the token and what can be done or cannot be done with it. Well, essentially, NFT allows you bragging rights, right? You claim you have a certificate of ownership, but when we talk about the issue of fraud or intellectual property, that may or may not be the case. So my sense is that depending on how it's structured, it is unlikely to be a DPT. And I'm happy to take in the views of my other fellow panelists on this. Rajesh, you seem to be nodding. Is it? because you are in agreement, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally, Nizam.
Okay. Okay, just on the next poll question, again, we just want to get the momentum up. So the poll question is, do you recognize the art piece in the previous slide?
Nizam, I was going to say that I think for this whole talk, right, you could almost just leave that art piece up there, and that just focuses everybody's mind on what this discussion is about.
So the options are yes. Second option just looks like just messy wallpaper.
Yeah, very expensive wallpaper.
You can give hints, Rajesh.
You know, that wallpaper that people saw, I mean, that particular artwork, yeah.
Okay, the poll result should be quite evident.
Sure.
Well, there are still people who think it looks like messy wallpaper. Okay. Well, value is subjective, isn't it?
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Next slide. So now that it's out of the way and you're jumping up for joy to say that, well, I can actually set up an NFT platform without a license. Again, you need to also do due diligence on the NFTs that are going to be listed on your platform if that's the case. But everyone's favorite topic, AML and CFT, especially on a Thursday afternoon. Next slide, please. So MES has made it amply clear that one of the things that they're most concerned with when it comes to cryptos or DPTs is AML, CFT. And that's because of pseudonymity or anonymity of tokens, the speed that you can transfer tokens, the cross-border nature of these transactions. And if you think about this, a lot of these factors actually are applicable to NFTs, whether or not they are digital payment tokens. And of course, along the way, the FATF issued a set of guidance, they call it, but in essence, it's a set of standards internationally on AML and CFT. And the fact that MES is primarily concerned about AML and CFT has been iterated on multiple locations as early as, I think, 2013, 2014, even before the PSA was spoken about, and more recently this year. Next slide, please. So, and we had a previous webinar on the FATF public consultation on further amendments to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And if we can go through to the next slide. So we had a webinar on this. Now, you would recall this, that one of the things that was touched upon was NFTs. And it was really unclear from the FATF's point of view whether they want to subject NFTs to be part or to be considered as a virtual asset. So if it's a virtual asset, then the whole guidance applies. What the FATF said is that their conception of a virtual asset is similar to a DPT under the PSA, that it must be digital, it must be traded for payment or investment purposes. So it could be a digital securities as well. But having said that, they actually said it cannot be just a mere representation of securities, fiat, or other financial assets without a payment or an investment purpose. So it seems that they are saying that NFTs are unlikely to be treated as a virtual asset because they're not fungible, right? And they're just a representation of value of Choon Leng's photographs or my bad music. Therefore, if that's the case, then it means that there's a very big gap when it comes to money laundering risk or terrorist financing risk. So let's see what the FATF says on this. But okay, there's always a but when it comes to, before you all jump for joy again and say that you don't have to do KYC checks. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what the MES says. So essentially the MES, again, this is fairly recent. They reiterated that AML is front and center when it comes to DPTs. Next slide. So should you be concerned? Now remember that other than the MES notices, we've got this thing called the CDSA. It's the most multi-syllabic legislation in Singapore, the Corruption, Drug Trafficking, Serious Offences, Confiscation of Benefits Act. So I kid you not, I remember what it stands for. Now, there are some generic money laundering offences. So if you assist somebody to retain the benefits of criminal conduct, so there are about a few hundred activities which are deemed to be criminal conduct. Or if you acquire, you possess, you use, or you transfer the benefits of criminal conduct, you would be caught for money laundering. And it's a very serious offense. mandatory custodial sentence. I think it goes up to 7 years or so. The other thing to note is that the element of constructive knowledge could be enough. So it's not whether you know, but even if you have reasonable grounds to believe that the other person who is someone buying your NFT, for instance, is a person who engages or who has engaged in criminal conduct or has benefited from criminal conduct. So remember, it's grounds to believe. Or the other limb for another money laundering provision talks about knowing or having reasonable grounds to believe that any property, in whole or in part, whether directly or indirectly, represents someone's benefit of criminal conduct. And you convert or you transfer that property. So you are, or you could be liable for money laundering, not the other person. And then there's this obligation to file suspicious transactions records when you know or reasonably suspect that any property represents proceeds of crime. So I think that even if the MES rulebooks are silent on this, there is a CDSA and it applies across the board. And if you look at how Singapore is looking at non-financial services transactions, we have the Precious Stones and Precious Metals Act, which is now subject to AML rules. And AML, of course, obligations apply to professional service providers like law firms or accounting firms. So I think AML and CFT compliance is still key, because otherwise you run the risk of facilitating, bad criminal behavior, and that is a money laundering offense that you could potentially commit. Okay, just to move on. Next slide, please. So question is, poll question number 3, are you convinced on the need for AML and CFT compliance? Can we run the poll? Let's just see how persuasive I have been. A, I don't want to go to jail. I am skeptic. It's a compliance burden, but no choice. So pick your options.
Okay, just gonna end this right now, even though more people are pressing. Okay, share the results. So majority still think there's a burden, but there's no choice. Typically, very common answer. I think everyone have no choice in Singapore.
All right, next slide. Okay, so the other issue is whether there are securities. So this really came on because I think early this morning, someone popped this in the chat room. And here is, we can go to the next slide. There is obviously a dispute. One of the parties essentially saying that the whole thing was illegal because you're offering a securities without complying with securities laws, and therefore it is illegal, and the whole thing should be set aside. So this article talks about the analysis in the US, the Howey test, right? Now again, remember that in Singapore, we've got the Securities and Futures Act, and we are subject to a slightly different analysis. Some of the principles would apply similarly in the US and Singapore, but I think remember that your default position shouldn't be just to say, because there's tons of stuff about the Howey test. That's a US case law interpreting US legislation. But remember that it is a bit different in Singapore. So in Singapore, the test is whether it's a securities is under the SFA, whether it's an equities, whether it's a debt contract, or whether it's a collective investment scheme. Now, something might have an investment value, but it doesn't make it a security. And I think the MES has pointed this out. There's been a couple of parliamentary speeches on this. And the senior MES officers has also made this point that we should look at the Singapore test. So this is not to say, in my view, that an NFT can never be a security. It can be. So for instance, if I set up an NFT that has got a pooling of assets and you pay some form of returns because the assets are being managed, for instance, that's similar to a collective investment scheme. But if I buy an NFT that is linked to a piece of art and that appreciates in value, the fact that it appreciates in value doesn't necessarily make it a security. It's no different from me buying a vintage guitar or an art piece or a vinyl record, even though it's bad music by Nizam, Ismail, and it appreciates in value. It doesn't make it a security. So happy to get the thoughts of my fellow panelists on this.
Yeah, there's a section that you've mentioned earlier, Nizam, where we're going to talk about fractional rights later. And I think that's going to be fun because then we're going to come back to this point. But I think it's helpful that at this point, the NFT focus has been so much on art. You know, you have a piece that goes for 69 million. You've got some that are going for less. And you have music pieces that are being sold as an NFT as well. I think that's helpful because it's relatable for most people. You then see in the physical world, what do we have as that, right? You can look at a piece of art, whether it is it's a Monet or something, and say that there's a value to it. But would two people agree on what the value is as compared to a US dollar, right? What's a US dollar worth? We say that, well, it is worth 1 point something Sing dollar, right? And it's there. There's very little scope for disagreement there. So that being the case, right, that seems to be one of the fundamental aspects of it being falling into something that is fungible. Now, you take that away, then you have the issue now about if there is value attached to it. And that's where we start wandering into the space to then say that, can it be a security? If you just look at it as one item, no. It's very difficult to make that argument, I think. But we are seeing more and more use cases of an NFT, more and more ways of trying to break it up or use cases. So that answer might change over time.
Yeah, thanks, Choon.
I mean, my view on this is that, there has to be some more thinking done, as in seriously done, on how this technology is to be utilized from a commercialization standpoint. People keep forgetting that, NFTs' greatest strength is in terms of identifying a particular asset, one piece, one image, one piece of creative work. That is what it is strongest for. But it doesn't lend itself well, NFTs, to any form of trading. And so then one has to ask yourself whether from a monetization standpoint, this instrument is the correct one to use. And that's what's leading now to this greater discussion about fractionalization of NFTs. To me, that is almost like, okay, this is an inherent flaw in the system itself. So let's fix it by putting another layer of fractionalization, rather than fixing the problem at the start and saying, why did we use NFTs to begin with regard to commercializing and monetizing a particular piece of art. So I think that there has to be some thought gone into whether or not the instrument, whether or not NFT is the correct instrument to use in terms of protecting a piece of art to begin with. And then around that, then you realize, look at the compliance related concerns and ask, is it the burden, if any, that NFTs are going to be exposed to will be worth the while of the individuals to use this technology. Right now, I think that the biggest people making the money are the wearables of the world, the chaps who are actually enabling NFTs to be put online, and the cost involved in buying gas and other elements necessary to sort of boost up your NFTs in a world of multiple NFTs that exist. Having said that, I'm not skeptical at the very least. I mean, we are all in this group here, those who see the skepticism around blockchain currencies and Bitcoin and the rest, and have lived to show that that's not in fact the case. So similarly, I believe the NFTs at this point, it's more a question of struggling to understand the proper and right way of using the NFTs. To me, that's the biggest market challenge today. Once that is clear, then the regulatory framework should fall into place. Right now, we're trying to fit square pegs into round holes. It doesn't quite work.
Thanks. Maybe we can move on to the next slide.
IP, shall I take on this portion? Yes,
Okay,
and
okay.
again,
Yes,
So before we go there, because there's one single question that's pretty interesting, right? So I think there's a question from the audience that asks, how would an artist know or care about the source of buyers' funds, right? So I think that's the question.
Yeah, I think this sort of probably a follow-on from my comments on the AML and CFT risks. Thanks, Bill. And anyway, Bill has written a good article on NFTs, which is on Medium. You can look it up. Fair point, I think. But I think, as with most things in life, it is very contextual, and it depends on the circumstances, right? So, for instance, if I sell a piece of art for $70 million and a guy comes and purchases it, and I refrain from asking questions about source of wealth and source of funds. Now, remember, this is $70 million. I think there probably would be some form of an implied obligation, or maybe not just implied, for me to make at least the necessary queries. I mean, if the guy has claims that he is a school teacher, for instance, and I think we value school teachers, but $70 million is a lot of money, and I don't ask about his source of wealth and source of funds, and it turns out that he actually had a shady background as doing nasty things, human trafficking and things like that, then I think when the proverbial thing hits the fan, investigations come in, I would be at risk. So I think it depends on the context of the situation. But in particular, if you are running an NFT platform, when you know that there are going to be transactions of real value going through your platform, and you don't have some form of AML or CFT program in place, I think the risks are even greater for people operating platforms, or if you're an intermediary. So that's my take on it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, if I could add to that, no, I think it's a very fair question from Bill. So let's talk about, so everybody knows Beeple, right? He of the 69 million piece. But before that, at some point as well, I was watching a documentary on it, and they mentioned about how at one point he was doing up, I think he sold about 500 pieces for about $1 each, right? Very generous of him. And but then he, of course, they went on to trade for a fair bit more, and obviously he picked up royalties after that. But if one were to do one NFT, sell it out, I think the example that Nizam gave is very good to then say that, look, if we're moving that kind of money, and assuming there is some, they talk about money laundering as a predicate offense that is being linked to a bigger crime. If it turns out that one piece that one created was then sold for a fairly large sum and was linked to a larger crime, it's very hard at that point to say that, well, I never knew it, or I didn't think I had the responsibility to check. I think the greater risk is probably one who then says that, well, I had some initial success selling NFTs, and you turn it into a bit of a volume business. You're doing more and more of it, whether or not the price increases. So Nizam mentioned the intermediaries, but even the creators, the originators, if over time they're actually creating it in volume, I would imagine that from a regulatory point of view, it is easier to say that they have some form of AML responsibility as well. So if I were to take it on a spectrum, right? If you're only doing one, the chance of it difficult. But if you're doing it in volume, the chance higher. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
Kevin, do you want to move on to the...
Yeah, let's move on. Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so moving on to the intellectual property side, I know there's some questions that are coming up already on the IP issues, and we'll all be happy to chip in on that. But just in particular for those who are not entirely familiar, the concern that people have with IP and NFTs is that we're talking potentially about, and actually about, two parallel rights that run concurrently over an asset. So purchasing an NFT does not mean that you're going to be owning the underlying IP rights of the work. It's a standard securitization model, right? So you've got the asset, and then you have another layer of ownership rights created on top of the asset itself. And it could well be that a person can, in a sense, own the IP and choose to sell NFT over that asset itself. And that's the challenge that people are going to have, is that NFT is merely a proof of ownership, which is separate from other rights, such as copyrights. And once that bifurcation occurs, that's when people start having fun, lawyers in particular, when you really have to worry about certain things like, okay, so I have an artist who's created this content, and now there's an NFT out there on the market. Do I need to do some form of due diligence to understand whether or not, when I purchase this NFT, the person who's actually putting it out there is someone who has actual rights over the IP that is being represented? Secondly, if you look at the nature of what is actually being put up, a lot of it is made up of what we call in the market mashups or memes. Memes tend to be, bits and pieces taken from existing IP, put in a different context or embellished in a certain sense, where it is not entirely clear whether the rights of the original person who created the content has in any way been extinguished. So it could just be a picture of someone and you put a hat on top of it and say, here's my picture or my interpretation of that image, and then put it out there and say, here's an NFT for this particular image. The question, of course, then becomes, what about the person who originally took that photograph of the person? What about the person whose photograph it is of? All of those rights do not get extinguished just because it is turned into an NFT. They coexist with the NFT rights. So as you look at acquiring rights in this space, do have a think about what exactly it is you're going to own. But remember what I mentioned earlier, the question to ask also is, what are you intending to monetize, right? Do you really need to own the underlying asset to be able to own the security on top of it? The answer very often is no. There are two different parallel rights that exist at the same time. So in that sense, the question may become, where and how should NFTs be created? Should there be a marketplace, for example, a governed regulated marketplace for NFTs where this can be put up, traded, as one question came in, traded as stock, for example. And then you have truly a secondary layer of securities created on top of the asset proper. And I think that may be very much the end state. Again, pure speculation on my part. So do remember in the meantime, though, as I mentioned, the rights coexist. So creators may have residual rights to issue more official copies of the prints of the original, and the buyer's rights in the NFT can be limited to rights to commercialize or rights with regard to royalties, etc. And the creator of NFT may not be the owner, as I say again, of the digital asset it represents. So do bear those things in mind when you're doing your due diligence. Next slide, please. Now, the issue of IP owners who grant licenses to third parties for use of their IP, you must take into account NFTs in the scope of that license as well. This is something that, again, is going to cause lots of interesting conundrums in future when people will focus purely on, in some way, dealing with the IP and then forgetting, intentionally or otherwise, the fact that that IP has in fact been securitized and a secondary layer of rights exists on the same intellectual property itself. So when you're dealing with licensing the work for use in NFTs, the license should expressly preclude, for example, the creation of NFTs. So when you're giving someone a right to use an image, it must be clear that, look, you can use that image, you can put it in your book, etc. You're given the specific permission to use, you scope out that license, and you expressly exclude the ability for that license to allow the person to create an NFT for that image itself. So then the licensors, I expect in future, in fact, now already the artists for whom we are helping, who are looking at this same issue and saying, look, moving forward, all my licenses need to be expressly limited in such a way that it says you are not allowed to take this image and create an NFT. Now, a lot of people have asked, fundamentally, why is this such an important thing? The reason why this has caught such a great degree of support is because the marketplace for IP has moved on from traditional IP-based licensing models. And what we're seeing here in NFTs is an expression of the frustration that people have with traditional copyright models and licensing models for content, right? In the old days, you buy software, you get a copy of the software off the shelf, install it on your computer, and you're good to go. What happens if people then, pirate copies of it, give the CDs to their friends, and they will use illegal copies of that software. And then the software rights owner has to go down and enforce his or her right, by taking legal action against people who haven't paid royalty for the software. That's your traditional licensing model in the software space. Similar for content as well, whether it's movies and other sort of images. The party who owns the right has to go down and assert his right against people who are using that content. Now, in the digital world, we've all moved towards a sharing economy, right? These days, you don't find, Sony having all the CD-ROMs and massive lorries driving over them and photographs being taken. I've taken a few selfies there as well, next to crushed CDs, in a past life. Those days are gone, well and truly gone. The problem we have is that the IP construct, the licensing models, are still based on the traditional means through which content is distributed. NFTs promise, basically, is, look, guys, IP is still there. Let it be. Here's another way of dealing with the content. So as many people as possible may want to make copies of the underlying image. So there's massive use of the image itself, which is in line with the sharing economy. But only one person has got the NFT to that token, and that is a non-fungible token tied only to that piece of art, and then value will increase purely because of scarcity for that NFT in isolation. That makes sense if you think about it, because it means that more and more people can actually use the content without having to fear from an IP standpoint. And at the same time, the person who owns the NFT still has the inherent right to monetize his ownership over the content proper. So a proper implementation of NFTs means, and this is very important, it means you are potentially looking at a model where you are willing to give up licensing fees. Give it up, right? And say my value for this content is fully captured in this NFT. And that's all I'm interested in. And if you're willing and daring and your content allows that to be the case, you will find NFTs works extremely well. But if it is a model where you're still expecting a license royalty type arrangement to be in place, and you have an NFT option in play, you need to think very carefully which route you're going to take. And if you take both, remember you're creating two parallel rights, and potentially it might mean double the money, but it also potentially mean nothing because the rights get compromised on one end, because NFTs mean that people can still use the underlying IP, and you will not have the time, energy, or effort to go out there and enforce your rights under IP. You will just make money from the NFT itself. So people are thinking, look, enforcement, not 2021 type things that people want to do anymore. Let's move towards this concept of securitization. Let the content grow. The more people that use the content, the better visibility for me, the higher the value of my NFT. So you flipped it all the way around. It's not a question of scarcity in terms of, I have the privilege of using this image. It's like, go use it, bring it out to the market. And when you use it, you increase the value of my NFT. That is the fundamental distinction to bear in mind and the mechanics behind this. I want to touch on that because, again, people always keep asking why IP and this and which one should I use? Think about what your actual monetization model is going to be. Yeah. So those are some of the challenges that exist as well with regard to IP. When licensing IP, as I said, to be converted into NFTs, always be clear what is the scope of the license, and if any restriction should be imposed, make sure you restrict NFT rights if that is something that you do not want to allow people to do. In fact, that's a standard practice today. And prohibit, restrict licensees from making modifications associated with the license work. That second point, or the third bullet point on the screen, is super important because that's where memes come from. And memes is where a significant amount of asset value is going to be made in the NFT space, undoubtedly, in my mind. It's still early days. People are still talking, oh, IP, the rights owner is going to sue. I have no doubt in 5 years' time, many of these memes will far exceed the numbers that you're looking at today. And people are not going to fight the IP fight anymore, because it could well be that the person who owns the original rights creates 15, 20, 30 versions of the memes themselves and are also monetizing it at the same time. And when that happens, and you go to court and say, Your Honor, this person is misusing my IP, the judge will say, but you got 20 other NFTs running at the same time, right? Over the same content. So what is the issue here? So principles of equity and the rest will also come to play when we look at the IP issues moving forward. Rather different, contrarian approach, I accept, but that's the way in which I see it playing out in the coming years. So those are some of the core issues. We can move to the next slide, please. In terms of implications for buyers, remember, do your due diligence. As I said, verify that NFT creator owns or has appropriate license over the IP right. Without doubt, for the buyer, that's key. And ensure that NFTs comes with suitable IP transfer of license agreement with terms consistent with the buyer's intended use of the NFTs. So this ties in with a question there where someone asked in the Q&A, why can't we do it concurrently? Absolutely, do it concurrently. When you do your due diligence, get both the IP rights as well as the NFT rights over the asset, and then you're good to go. Next slide. For the creators, key thing to bear in mind, ensure your relevant licenses obtained prior to using third-party IP to create NFTs, please. And there are lots and lots of memes out there that are on Rarible today. You'll be looking at it and you're wondering, so to what extent is mashup going to work? And a lot of interesting insight can be obtained when you look at rap music, for example, in the early days of copyright, where people take a certain riff and they put that riff in, and then they start building a song around that theme. Do remember, copyright laws do exist over fragments in a sense as well. And if you don't believe it, just go and read up on Men at Work and their very famous piece, which uses a little bit of Kookaburra Sits on the Old Gum Tree, and then that was it. They lost rights over the entire song. And the rest is history. People died and everything else. So it is real. These rights are real. And I'm sure, just like it was the case in the music industry, there will be cases with regard to memes where people say, again, I own that little picture there. You can't just put a head on top of me and say, this is a new image. No, it doesn't work that way. So do the due diligence. Ensure NFT Creator is consistent with scope of rights received from IP rights owners and the terms and conditions under which such third IP was licensed to you. The consistency is key. So please do bear that in mind. Yeah, in terms of both the IP rights and the NFT rights. Next slide, please. Fractional rights. So fractionalized rights, I'm just going to touch at the top level, and then I look forward to inputs from Choon, Leng, and from Nizam as well. The next slide, please. So this is where we spoke earlier about the fact that, okay, so NFTs is this new thing which will allow me to have a specific right over an image, right? But this right, this token that I get is non-fungible, i.e. I can't break that token up into smaller parts and sell it off. It's just one token for that one piece of artwork. So how do you then monetize that? Then that becomes a question that's to be asked. And of course, when you've got very creative people in the industry, they say, well, let's just fractionalize. We fractionalize everything. Let's fractionalize NFTs. So NFTs itself cannot be subdivided because it's non-fungible. But let's issue a shared ownership right over the NFT, and then it allows the NFT owner to, in a sense, realize liquidity from the NFT holdings without selling the entire NFT off itself. Very logical. Again, the question is, what kind of fractionalization rights are being created? Next slide, please. So here, it is still a very early days. Right? Clearly, the rights accorded to an investor in a fractional NFT is not entirely clear, and it really depends on the project, the negotiated terms, and the tokens involved. We've seen different applications of this model already, and the Q&A, I'm happy to share some examples. But what is clear from a regulatory standpoint is that it's still a concern. The concern being that fractional NFTs may constitute securities and therefore be regulated as such. I would argue this one out, and I'm happy to see what my fellow panelists have as well, their thoughts on this. But the position, in my mind, certainly is less than settled. I mean, I can certainly see securitization arguments used in many others, but for fractionalized NFTs, I think it's one that's worth a fight. But I leave it at that, and then hand over to the rest. Now, do we have another slide on fractional? I think that's the only two, right? Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's a very good part of it, because I think that probably ties in with the question by Mohan, who's asking about why can't the NFT of a painting together with the rights to acquire the original, and can it be done instantaneously like what you just said, right? And then of course you will acquire a valuable asset. So yeah, so this question, we really considered that piece, an answer you have given when you were talking about it just now.
Yeah. My point being that it's not instantaneous as such. It's not a timely issue of timing. It's really a question of addressing both issues at the same time. So asking what is the IP position, asking what's the NFT position, and then getting the specific rights that you want. And if it's both, then recognize that it'll be two different instruments, right? One will be, either what we call an assignment of rights to you, or license of the rights to you, and then the second will be the NFT and the transfer of the token. So two different rights, but should be done concurrently if that is what you intend to achieve. That may not always be the case, though, and not in the sense that I say again, the value of the token and how you intend to monetize it, we need to move away from the old model of licensing content. That's really when the true value of NFTs will come to the fore. When people realize that it is not the scarcity, right? It's not that I've got one copy of the book, and if you want that copy of the book, you need to buy it from me. It's that I'm going to make that book available everywhere to anyone, but I still am registered and understood and known to be the owner of that book. And the more people that use it, the greater the usage and visibility of my content, the higher the value of my token. So then I'm not looking at monetizing based on licensing the 1,000 readers of my book. I'm just going to say I'm the owner. I've got 50,000 readers of my book. And do you now, Mr. So-and-so, want to own this token that says that you are in fact the owner of this book. So that requires a huge mindset change. And I think the market is still kind of digesting that phase of what NFTs are going to be. And it's still right now that coexistence of IP rights and NFTs. We haven't built out the business models yet for true implementation of NFT-based media exploitation and value creation. That's the kind of discourse I would like to see happening in the industry.
Any further comments from the rest of the panelists?
Yeah, can I ask, and then I'm going to ask Rajesh a question, and I'm going to be fair to him. So I'm going to ask a question, give him some time to think about it, then I'm just going to make a comment also, right? So I like the way you described it, right? To then say that, look, the old model, the one that we've used for more than 100 years is, look, you create something, you have the copyright to it, and then you license it, you earn royalty fees from it, and maybe you can even sell it, right? There are a few ways to monetize. And the way you described it is very progressive, very innovative, to then say, well, we need to move away from that thinking that when you sell the NFT, actually sell the copyright together with it as well. Can I ask your thoughts, and probably two parts of the question? Where do you think the market will head to? Let's say in about 1 or 2 years' time. And also, second part of the question, which direction do you prefer the market to actually go into? Right. So just to give you a moment to think about it. And actually, I just wanted to point out, there was this Business Time article, I think this was about 2 weeks ago, where they featured a company called Republic. So this is actually a clothing company, and I think this is actually in Singapore, where the owner actually said that he actually sold the NFT for, I think, was some dress or blouse that he was selling. But together with it, so the NFT was sold, or this was offered for higher than if you were to buy the actual piece. But together with it comes the copyright. And he had this very interesting quote where he said, I'm not sure if people would actually do that being sell the NFT together with the copyright, but we are giving them the full rights. So he seems to be in your camp, Rajesh.
Yeah, thanks for that, Choon. And my view basically is this. I think you need to recognize that there are different kinds of rights that lend itself to NFTs. As you rightly say, it doesn't apply to every kind of IP. And I think the way the market will move is this. There's a high degree of high value, short-term, big impact content that comes through virality that you see in the marketplace today. So something goes viral, and that is is in the zeitgeist of people. It almost dominates every nature, every discussion they have, every email that you send out, you use the word umbrage for about 3 to 4 weeks, right? Because that became the word. Now, you can create that through certain socioeconomic incidents that occur, as in this case, or you can engineer something like that. And I expect that when you look at using NFTs effectively, creating a token, you need to recognize that your monetization time window could very likely be extremely small, right? And people don't get that. They say, I have a right, just like I have a copyright, I can own it, and then I can pass it on to my kids and generation after generation. No, I believe the NFTs allow you to very quickly, once we get the system up and running effectively, it's still early days there. It's not easy to go to Rarible and all that to list. I know my son and I spent a whole weekend creating our own NFTs. Good fun, bonding and all that, but I wish it was easier. And so with all of that done, what I know for a fact is that the process can still be improved. Once the process is improved, the speed at which NFTs are created will increase. Once that happens, the monetization timeframe for NFTs will be much shorter. You can look at making like $3 to $5 million over a period of 2 weeks, after which NFTs is worth nothing, or a small amount. And I think that sort of thinking needs to go into looking at monetization of NFTs rather than this longer term play. And if you look at it from that standpoint, what it also means is that IP is not going anywhere. IP rights are still significant, they're still important. We need to ensure we protect those rights, but at the same time, with this ability to now monetize effectively, quickly, certain types of items like digital icons, words, etc. That's how NFT should be used and monetized. And so that's again how you will coexist. And why I say again, getting both may not be necessary. If it's only going to be worth money for 2 weeks, why go through the entire process of creating a license agreement or an assignment agreement, which will probably get signed only 3 weeks after the monetization campaign is complete? And I think that's the kind of world that this technology really is suited for. And we're only starting on that journey now. So the concept of virality, the concept of short-term high returns is where NFTs, I think, is really going to start shining. And why I see the two rights as separate and distinct, IP and NFT rights.
So do I take it that that's your that's what you favor in terms of its development as well?
Yeah, it's fresh, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it comes, it goes. I mean, words like umbrage are not new words. They come, they go, and they'll come again another 10 years. In between, there'll be lots and lots of these rights and memes that come out. Again, what I mentioned there is that you can't wait for it to happen. If you have a business case, you must have an engineering ability or ability to engineer virality. And the people who are engineering virality today are primarily the social media organizations themselves, right? The Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and the rest. And people who can leverage off them through the marketing campaign. So using AdSense and things like that to start pushing a certain campaign or agenda and making money from that standpoint. That's really how monetization of NFTs is going to take off in a real sense. So we're looking forward to that. And we're already seeing some very bright young chaps already started the journey, even in Singapore today.
So exciting. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah. Nizam, Kevin?
No, I think we're moving on to the next area, Choon. I think which is yours.
Yes. Fraud. Choon Leng, you're taking this, right? Oh.
Choon, you're on mute.
You know, you would thanks. So you would think that after a year of doing this, right, you will be better at it. But there you are. Okay. No. So the fraud points and all. No, this is interesting, right? So we talked about the fractionalization of the NFT itself, and in terms of how you have, you know, the various people's owning it. Could you imagine a situation where you have 1,000 people fractionalize over an NFT they think is valuable? Turns out that there is a, you know, whether there's a counterfeit issue. But here, I think the issues around the resistance to fraud. So the problem is the non-fungible nature of the NFT itself is what makes it very difficult to actually use it as an instrument of fraud. Because the nature of your blockchain makes it such that, look, everybody on this call knows how it works. Whatever is in there, you can't actually change it over a period of time, right? You can actually go back there to go and check who actually owns it. You can't run away for that. But that doesn't mean that the NFT itself cannot be used to fraudulently attribute designs to multiple owners. So we had the case of Derek Loftman, and who put up on sale. He said he minted an NFT and listed for sale without his permission, or rather that he was the victim of such an incident. And I think that goes back to one of the points that Nizam made earlier. Then in the first place, actually was Rajesh who said that when you put something up for sale, right? The first question is, what are you putting up for sale? It is the NFT itself, so it's a code. But who actually owns the underlying item, right? Copyright ownership rights are not going away. IP laws are not going away. But you can only sell what you actually have. So in this case here, and I think it's been said a number of times, that in the first place, before you put something up for sale, it's actually really important that you actually have ownership rights to it. Nizam?
Yeah, I think to a large extent, I mean, fraud, theft, forgery, cheating, I mean, they exist even in the pre-blockchain world, and I think some things unfortunately don't change. So, you know, theft, quite simply, you know, someone creating an NFT with really no real, he didn't own the intellectual property rights. I mean, that's cheating or forgery. And the thing about the blockchain is that it doesn't prevent theft. I mean, it's good in preventing forgeries, but you know, you don't validate of you know, whether the creator in fact has the rights to begin with, or the creator of the NFT has rights to begin with. So there are lots of examples NFTs created without the permission of the original artists involved. There are many instances of fake or replica NFT stores out there, fake social media platforms pretending to be NFT platforms. And then there are the usual, put the tokens in this wallet, I'll give you a lot of returns for it. And of course, they're the usual, I pretend to be a platform and I get your login address. So it's a very classic get your password kind of fraud. So unfortunately, these bad habits follow into the blockchain universe. And there are things you can do on an ex post facto basis if you're aggrieved. I mean, these are criminal acts, so you can lodge a police report. But the question is, enforcing it in a digital realm might be inherently challenging. But the question is, how do you mitigate and protect yourself against the incidents of fraud? Fundamentally, you can't always insulate yourself for that because that risk always exists. But there are things that you can do to, it goes back to buyer beware, doing your due diligence, even, looking up an image on Google or doing a reverse or flip image and things like that, and doing your due diligence on the sites. But unfortunately, there's always going to be an inherent risk involved, I think.
Yeah. Rajesh, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's by its very nature, I think you can look at the strength and the weakness of NFT. So on one hand, people keep forgetting the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization still today. So, there will still be some ability for people to pretend to be who they are not, and to try and put in place some false information to mislead. And again, because of the fact that while we can call it fraud, I think a lot of people will confuse again fraud with the fact that people have willfully misrepresented and sometimes unknowingly misrepresented themselves as owners of the content when you're dealing with things like memes and mashups. So I think, while yes, there certainly will be people who try to cheat the system. I think the bigger problem is going to be the fact that a lot of people will assume that the activity was fraudulent, when in fact it may not be, or arguably it may not be, because it could well be something that's protected under fair use rights. So I think that these are some of the technical issues, and again, happy to take it on separately. But apart from that, totally agree with the points that Nizam and Choon Leng have put forward.
Okay.
Thanks, Rajesh. Nizam?
Okay. Kevin, do you want to move on to the next segment?
Yeah, let's move on to the next topic. Data privacy.
Privacy, yes. I can start off on this one if you want. Just to move on. I mean, the key issue here is really the fact that, and to me, it's mechanical and a sign of bad design. If you're actually going to be putting significant amounts of personal data on a blockchain, recognize that blockchains are by design immutable. Immutability means that the data cannot be removed at any point in time. You can sort of mark it out, strike it out, and using the word loosely here, but you can never take that data out. Okay? So you can mark it up, put another data set on top of it, etc., just like you would in a ledger, right? So, and that's the problem you have with data protection, because under data protection, individuals have a right to withdraw consent. And in the European context, under the GDPR, they have the right to erasure as well, which means that they have the right to go to someone and say, take all your information about me out from your systems. I don't want you to hold any of my personal data anymore. And the organization needs to give due credence to that, which is why you've seen cases like the ones in Google, etc., where Google in the end voluntarily agreed to sort of remove data from the search engines of individuals, where they say, I don't want my personal data to be searchable on your search engine. So with that sort of rights in place, and with the immutability of blockchain technology, the challenge is if you put any personal data elements on a blockchain, you're going to find it technically impossible to comply with the GDPR, and you will then be technical breach of data protection laws. Now, this kind of exposure may not be a serious thing. And again, to me, it tends to be more academic than real, simply because the parties involved in these trades, right? So the nodes, in the context of a blockchain community, would, so long as they're part of the node, be fine with their data being on the system, because they need to be seen to be owning a specific asset on the blockchain, or to be named carrying out a specific transaction, or owning a bit of the currency on the blockchain. So it's fine for the name to be there because it's mechanically necessary. But theoretically, yes, you know, that data can, the individual has the right to pull that data out. So that's the challenge. And with blockchain-based technologies like NFTs, you cannot remove the data set. So you'll be in breach of the GDPR. In Singapore's context, we don't have a right to be forgotten or right to erasure, but we do have a retention limitation obligation under the PDPA. And there again, it says that you can keep data for so long as you have a legal or commercial purpose for doing so. And blockchains are not, you know, always live. And so there may be certain instances where the name needs to be removed. For example, where there's a change in the ownership of the NFT itself. Again, blockchain technology is such that you cannot remove that data set. The personal data element, if you introduce it into the blockchain instance, will remain there. And that again means that you may technically not be able to comply with the retention obligation under the PDPA in Singapore. So next slide, please, and then you know, we can discuss. So implication for creators, implication for buyers. For creators, basically, NFTs that contain personal information might be incurable, as I said, and therefore technically in violation the moment you design and start implementing such blockchains. Again, the actual real impact of this, to me, and again, being very, very blunt here, is more academic than real, but it is there. So, you know, beware of that fact. And again, implication for buyers is that information contained on the blockchain is pseudonymized rather than anonymized. So as a result of the indirect information that can be used to decipher identities and transactions recorded on the blockchain, your personal data might be permanently accessible. And that really, to put it very simply, is the analogy I shared. And it is an analogy. Technically, it doesn't quite work that way, where you can write your name and you can never remove it from the blockchain, but you can strike it out. When you strike something out, it's not really removed, right? It is still there, but it is struck out. So you can still see the data element, which means that you can never truly delete content, including personal data from these systems. I'll pause there, and I'm happy to see if there's any questions or talk about it more.
So given that, I mean, besides obviously the information of individuals and all that, there's also some elements of like information capture in each NFTs, which is right now they are kind of distributed on the blockchain and all that. Do you foresee that eventually data sovereign laws will come in terms where, you know, that particular set of data need to be kept within that country itself and stuff like that? And how does that affect the whole distributed, decentralized nature of blockchain, where even files are being shared across? Yeah.
We've got to fight this. We've got to fight data sovereignty. I think it's a greater scourge when it comes to principles and concepts of data analytics. And most importantly, it's really just posturing by politicians wanting to sort of fool the citizens about the importance of having their data localized in country. There's no guarantee if your data is kept in your country that's going to be more secure than if it is kept in a properly run, properly audited cloud system, universally put in place, like Azure system or Amazon S3 system, or any of the other respected cloud architecture that's available today. In fact, I would say that the risk is greater if the data is stored on site in terms of hacking, as opposed to distributed cloud-based models where every data packet is broken up and stored in 3 or 4 different servers, making hacking a much more difficult task than it would be if it's stored locally. So, that's my view on data localization. And I'm glad that in Southeast Asia, at least, organized countries that have been pushing the agenda, like Indonesia, have walked it back. India has also walked back data localization requirements in their upcoming data protection law. And I think right now, the only one holding out is Vietnam. But Vietnam is a very different type of country, so it will take a while to change their laws. But having said that, it's good to see that at least in ASEAN context, and that comes from a lot of strong lobbying from progressive countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore to ensure that data localization does not take foot in ASEAN. Because if we, as ASEAN, intend to reach out and create a single marketplace, there's no space for data localization.
Any comments from the rest of the guys?
No, I think the issue of data localization, I think we've been fighting that one for a couple of years already. but maybe just for the purposes of this crowd here, that I think at some point, again, it's going to be one of those which I think for people who are planning at some point to actually deal. Well, there's the individual case where there's certain data that's actually put into the NFT itself. But then if we're talking about parties who are issuing a large number of NFTs over a period of time, I would imagine that just maintaining data itself, it's where the challenge is going to be. But probably no different from church responsibilities if they're dealing with something else as well, whether we go back
on
to
the website justdisciple.com
or otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin. Is Kevin frozen?
Oh, Kevin's frozen. Okay.
No, he's back on.
I'm back on. The Google Assistant suddenly spoke and it froze my screen. The thing with AI, right? You don't know what they are thinking. So, yeah, I think and if there's any other comments, I think we can move on to the next one. Before probably that's the final one on censorship. Very interesting. Yep. Next slide. Oh, okay. So I think this is really very much open for discussion on the censorship, right? So who want to start the topic off first? Because I think I mean the context of this is this, right? Right now, NFTs, the artwork and all that is pretty liberal, right? Especially outside of Singapore, right? So obviously on US platforms and overseas platforms, you have all kind of artwork. You have all kind of NFT artists that consist of people who brings in art that are well, arguably in certain countries will be deemed as objectionable, right? And potentially to be censored. And some are actually going towards kind of like, I think not just beyond objectionable, I think probably they need to be censored, right? So the question is that, in future, how does this going to be working out, right? For instance, Singapore, we know that definitely media and stuff like that are actually regulated by IMDA, who is actually a regulator for media and communications. So I'm quite sure laws like that will come in once, obviously the regulators catch up on, the proliferation of media by NFT. So I mean, it's open discussion to see how that's going to affect in terms of acceptance on NFTs, because right now it's like pretty wild west. I've seen artwork that's just really crazy. Some bordering on pornography, some openly taking up sharing of like the marijuana leaves and stuff like that. That kind of thing, which obviously it's not acceptable in Singapore. But yeah, open for discussion on that.
But this is a fun one, right? And I think as Nizam and Rajesh have been at pains to share that, and we've seen that on the net 20 years ago. We've seen it in the blockchain world the last couple of years, and certainly it's true in NFTs as well, that the underlying law of the land still applies. Some people will say, unfortunately, it still applies. But then when it comes to issues of there is, I was going to say there isn't any, but I might be able to think of exceptions. But I was going to say there isn't anything that you could do through an NFT or on an NFT that you are otherwise not allowed to, right? So pornography, for example, right, or the use of drugs. If you had something that capture it, I mean, just an image is very for the use of drugs. But let's say pornography, you have the NFT itself, and you have the underlying piece of art, right? I think to own something that is deemed, or let's not talk pornography. Let's talk something that may stroke, let's say, racial tensions, right? Which is an important issue in this country. You actually, if you are not allowed to own something per se under that law, owning the NFT becomes an interesting point, because as Rajesh has pointed out, I may own an NFT, but I don't actually own the underlying thing. So does that therefore give you some kind of ownership right without the liability of actually owning the underlying offensive work? Nizam, Rajesh?
Yeah, interesting point, Choon. I think, like you said, you still need to look at the underlying laws. I think if you take something offensive, typically there is a prohibition against possession, let's say, of pornography or something that's morally offensive. And the question is, when you have an NFT over a piece of art that is offensive or pornographic, whether you are deemed to possess that piece of art. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. I think it's a matter of, I think it's an issue of the law not catching up with advancements in technology, but that'll be interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think, the existing laws will still come to bear, whatever form the IP may manifest itself in, and the exposure will be to the person who is deemed to own that IP. But also, I think sometimes the action is to be taken against the creator of the IP. I think the biggest risk issues will be addressed, will come up and rear its head when exchanges need to have policies in place on censorship and say that, we don't agree to this particular content being made available on our exchange. And then the NFT effectively, cannot be monetized because of positions taken by certain exchanges, or all exchanges for that matter, based on social economic standards. So something like Black Lives Matters, for example, something sensitive like that may not be acceptable to an exchange that may have a very left-wing, right-wing view. I always keep forgetting who's on the left and who's on the right in the US. So if that then happens, you may not get your document or your content listed on that site. So I think the issue will often come up in the context of policies, content policies that organizations create, rather than state level censorship rules and criminal sanctions that flow from that, because that's going to be applied universally, no matter which instrument it is. If the content itself is offensive, the state will object. But I think on censorship at a more binary level, that's what we are, I think, going to start feeling when exchanges start putting in place policies as to what kind of content can be listed on their sites. And that is a different form of censorship. It's exchange-focused censorship, and I think that will be something to look out for and make sure that your content falls within the parameters of what's acceptable in the exchange that you choose to monetize in. Yeah.
Kevin, back to you.
Right. Okay. So I think if that's all we have for censorship, I think let's probably approach some of the questions. Probably I'll just start off with, basically I think Sasho Markov has been asking quite a few, right? So I think a couple of questions he asked is that who does it actually, who values the NFT? Because I think, in lieu of a proper marketplace, right, it seems to be that no one's really kind of put a value to it. I mean, it's just like, okay, this piece of artwork is going to be worth 10 million, it's going to be worth 10 million. I think that's probably his questions coming from. And I think he's been revolving about a question on this, saying that is there a secondary market? He's saying that shouldn't NFT be traded on security tokens exchange? So maybe we can answer that question first, because I think he broke out into a couple of questions, but that's essentially what he's asking. Anyone to take that on?
I mean, it's how do you value a vintage Fender Stratocaster guitar? I mean, there probably are some reference points out there, but fundamentally, it's willing buyer, willing seller, and what is the perceived value. Can you trade the Fender Stratocaster on a secondary market? The answer is yes. So you can theoretically create, and I think there are marketplaces where you can trade NFTs. There might be some form of price discovery, but remember, it's non-fungible. Everything is unique. So can you find a comparable price point? Maybe, maybe not. Do you have to trade it on a securities exchange? If it's not a securities, you don't need to trade it on a securities exchange. I think it goes back to the earlier point where I don't think it is currently caught under the rule book. But again, you need to assess whether the platform operator needs to assess whether the NFTs are in fact securities or not. So there has to be a due diligence process. But if it's not, anybody can set it up. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Okay. I think let's go through the few other questions as well. I think thanks for the answer. So I think the first one, okay, come back to by Joel. Okay, so about the minimum level of KYC needed for the platform to comply with the Singapore laws. So in terms of what kind of proof of funds and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think that question is being asked. Probably Nizam.
The short answer is there isn't a prescribed limit as to, I mean, for the regulated financial institutions, of course, you have to look at the MES notices, and there might be certain limits, but they differ from entity to entity. So for instance, in crypto, under the PSNO2, there isn't a limit. So if I buy $1 worth of Bitcoin, technically the platform provider has to KYC me, even if it's $1. But when you, so remember, we're talking about general principles of money laundering liability, right? I mean, if a transaction is in the millions of dollars, arguably the risk of laundering is even greater, and it goes up along with the value of the transaction amount. For that reason alone, private banks conduct very extensive KYC checks because the value of the transaction is a lot. So similarly, if you're selling an art piece and that's worth millions of dollars, I think the greater the value, the greater the expectation that you at least have to verify certain bits of information about the buyer, particularly if you're a platform, as opposed to an individual seller of the NFT.
Okay, that's cool. So the next question is that in terms of the NFT regulation or tokenization of Singapore property title deed, and I think this is a very interesting question because I think ever since there was the news of the first NFT on a house being sold in Germany, I think that there's a lot of discussion and a lot of queries on how to do NFT on properties, what are the proper structure and all that. So I think that Australia, they have actually figured something out, which is why they were able to do an NFT on a parking lot for investment. So comments from the panel, right? How is this made possible? Like for instance, the title deeds on property in Singapore and make property to be sold on NFTs. Yeah.
So if I could, I mean, Mike, if you're still on the call, right? I mean, I'll invite you to elaborate on that question as well, because this whole thing about tokenizing property, whether in Singapore or overseas, we've been seeing it for some time. I recall a case years ago, and it wasn't a Singapore situation where you had that same rule, the idea of can you have multiple owners of a property, right? If you think about it, the whole REITs market is trying to address exactly that issue. If we talk about real estate, they tend to be big ticket items, whether it's a residence or a commercial property. And that idea of breaking up ownership so that you can have many people own a small piece of it and therefore collectively buy it seems to be the holy grail of real estate investment in all markets. So related to that, and we've seen some projects and a lot of discussion has been taking place for a number of years about using blockchain to record property ownership. Again, that seems to be one of the strongest use cases for the blockchain, right? Because then it's very clear who owns what. Singapore is almost a poor example of it, because here actually we have a strata title, we have our units. It's quite clear who owns what. But you take a much larger country, you take where your boundaries are a lot less clear. Being able to put all the ownership rights onto some form of ledger and then keep track of it is wonderful. So I relate that, because then that you seem to be then talking about when you say tokenizing it. So if you can move from actual property deeds onto the blockchain, then as a next step to actually turn it into ownership by NFT seems to be one step closer. I'll invite thoughts from Rajesh and Nizam, but I'll just end by saying that I think there have been a lot of discussions, and happy to learn more about the Australian example. But I think for a lot of them, they haven't gotten to that point.
Yeah, I mean, in Singapore's context, I think we're still struggling with fundamentals. I'm still very upset that we still don't have a fully digital end-to-end system for trading when it comes to land. Even though we are on a torrent system, which is similar to the Australian model in law, we still have a lot of land that is still, mukim this, mukim that, still not modernized and moved to the new land titles regime. And until all that is done, and it's a lot of work, so it's not that for want of trying, but it has taken a while. And until we have a fully digital model in place, I expect that the authorities' focus is going to be on that for now, rather than going into spaces like NFT. To me, that's an opportunity lost, or rather delayed, because it'd be great if you can start jumping straight in. Having said that, you don't need to wait for the land registries to get their act together when it comes to NFT and property, at least in terms of some of the offerings that I'm starting to see. Again, it's creating a layer of interest, that coexist together with the rights of the original owner. The interesting proposition here is whether or not a securitization layer on property can be created without the involvement of the actual landowner themselves. It's akin to thinking of, a strata title, right, in space. And then you have the land, and then you have space ownership. What about creating a third layer on top of space and call it ether? And say, now I'm selling you rights in ether for that same piece of land. Where does the ether sit? It's not on the land. It's not in the space above the land. It exists in the space above that. As ethereal as that sounds, that is the pitches that we're hearing right now in the property space. This amorphous new right over land. So you're basically going to do something like take Google Maps and say, okay, this plot of land in the middle of Sahara, right? I assert rights over it in the ether. And I'm now going to sell rights over that space in ether for that piece of land to you. Would you like to buy it? Yeah, and so that's the sort of thinking that's going on right now. It's still early days. I think people are starting to say some part of it is silly, some parts of it are not, and we have to wait and see. Apart from that, the traditional ones are what you see in Australia today, where it's basically tied to existing to real land. But I totally agree with Choon Leng. I think the true value in blockchain technology really is in the recordal. Just having a secure place where you can actually register and record the title. So I'm hoping that we'll be hearing news from SLA, or Singapore Land Authority, and others on how Singapore is forging to the blockchain space when it comes to land title registration. So I live in hope.
Okay. Next question, I think, is probably the one that we can cover with Ethan, right? So, okay, so basically, the NFT trades are largely cross-border. The question is that how would the dispute be resolved, right? Under which jurisdiction when dispute comes up, given that it tries mainly on anonymity and exists on the blockchain, on smart contracts and all that, where enforcement can be tricky, right? So if there's a dispute of the artwork and stuff like that, how can it be actually enforced? Now, this also ties into a question as well, and I'm not sure it can be linked to the same question. And this is a case study, right? So let's say, assume this guy, right, smart, very smart businessman. He pays a very poor artist, right, who come up with an artwork for $10. After getting everything done, he pays the guy. There's no legal contract and all that. He actually NFT that piece of artwork and said for $10,000, right? And then the artist along the way heard about it. He wants to lay a claim to that original which he did for that guy, right? So how do you actually claim rights to that? He can claim intellectual property, right? Because he's the one who did it, but there's no legal contract to say things like that, right? So how does that work? And probably tying in with what just the question coming from Ethan is about.
Why is always the poor artists? I think artists actually are very smart people these days. The artists I've been engaging with in the NFT space are actually fairly sophisticated bunch. Young people who sort of really understand the value of virality and the rest. So I think, maybe we should give the artists a bit more credit. I think they won't be so easily fooled, especially now that, things like NFTs are somewhat largely people are aware. I think even in School of the Arts in Singapore, people are looking at can we register this? Can we register that? Because the students are coming up with so many interesting pieces of artwork. I know my son studies there. So with things like that going on, I think what's going to happen is, yes, people will potentially try and cheat. But if I were to use the use case that was used there, if the person had properly purchased the art piece from the artist for $10, and there's an agreement that's been made that you give me all rights over this, and then with that right, now the person goes and creates an NFT, the artist has to accept that he made a bad bargain to begin with, right? And then subsequently to try and find arguments in equity and all that. Yes, I suppose, you get a smart lawyer and pay him lots of money, arguments can be made, but it'd be a losing battle. And that's why, we mentioned in the earlier slides, for the creators of NFTs, if you don't intend to allow the person you're selling the right to create NFTs, you limit your license accordingly. So the message to artists out there is, today, know that the value in your content is not just in the software or the IP itself, it's also in the manner in which that right can be used. And so if you say you can use this in a certain way, try and avoid words like unqualified and unlimited usage. Put in specific limitations with regard to NFTs and say that you can't create NFTs, and see whether or not the person will then pay you $10 or something closer to $2,000 to $3,000 for the piece of work. And I think there's a need for educating artists to understand that this is not an unreasonable ask today, because a lot of people are monetizing art pieces through NFTs. So control your rights, don't give it up. That's the best way to go about it. Which country's law would apply? It will be no different from any litigation strategy today. You look at the issue of enforcement. You will take action in a country where you can enforce the judgment, right? Of course, there are many laws. I can talk to you about Lex Fori, Lex Loci, and all the rest of it, the proper forum for the jurisdiction. But strategically and practically speaking, that you will try and find a place where the owner happens to reside, to be able to assert rights against that person themselves. Now, that's one part of it. The other part is getting the NFT transferred over in a real sense. There will be certain technical impediments, and again, happy to take that offline, because you'll need to be able to go to the specific person and get the title transferred over. Let's say in the context of saying that this was improperly acquired by someone. Reversing that trade and all the rest of it will just be a reversal of the ownership rights on the exchange. So once you can get the person who actually owns it to agree that they have done something wrong, they will then make necessary changes at exchange level to change title over to yourself. So I wouldn't be dictating jurisdiction by where is the exchange. I'll be looking at it primarily from the position of where is the owner of the asset, against whom action is going to be taken for ease of enforcement.
Yeah, I agree with Rajesh on that. I'm going to ask Nizam and Rajesh for their thoughts on it, right? Because just to talk about this a little bit more, it's going to happen, isn't it? Right? Your NFT is a code that is linked to something else. For ease, let's just talk, it's an art piece on a particular website. At some point, it's going to happen. Someone's going to cut the link, and you're going to click on it, and you actually, the art piece doesn't exist anymore. Your digital bragging rights literally disappear.
Yeah.
It's what's going to happen then? I ask it as an open question. Nizam's thoughts?
Let me chew on this, Rajesh. I'm going to pass it to you.
Could you rephrase the question?
So look, it's good. No, in a sense you already answered.
Where I'm coming from, right? Because I can answer that in a few different ways. But
yeah, I mean we haven't seen it yet, as far as I know, right? But it's also, the explosion for NFTs has really only happened in the last not even year, 6 months even, right? 7 months, a bit more. So now or later, someone's going to buy, and it may not be a 69 million piece, but let's say it's worth fighting over. Let's say it's $1 million, right? Or 10, right? 10 million, and someone literally cuts the link, and you click on basically you click on your blockchain, your token, and it shows nothing. It doesn't link to anything. Right?
Yeah, because it's a URL, right? End of the day.
Yeah.
That's tied to, and the content could disappear. And that really boils down again to your own due diligence in terms of securing the underlying intellectual property itself. Digital media is by nature malleable. Right? It is easily copied. It is easily taken and changed in form from one format to the other, digital, and then you can print it out again. So with that kind of content, the chance or the possibility of losing it, I think, is quite slim. And secondly, you need to bear in mind also that the NFT itself will be tied to a specific URL. And if you look at how NFTs are architected today, if you, let's say, take something and put it on Rarible and the rest, that's really the instance that's being monetized, right? So the risk factor will be, can a Rarible, for example, collapse or be compromised or be hacked, for example, to the extent that every one of the listings disappear. That's a risk factor worth considering. But again, bearing in mind that you're dealing with NFTs, each of which is a standalone blockchain in and of itself, blockchain-based implementation, the risk factor, I think, is not very significant. It can happen, but I don't see it becoming too much of an issue, practically speaking.
Kevin?
Okay. Okay, so I think probably moving on to the next one is a very broad question from Ken. So Ken is from Japan. So I think the very broad question is to say, how does Singapore compare to other jurisdictions in terms of the regulatory treatment for NFTs and all that? I mean, this is a very broad question. If we know, we can actually kind of answer this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, let's ask Meta Coven. He'll give you the answer to that.
Maybe let me jump in. I think, I mean, and I don't think we're probably at a space where regulators are still looking at NFTs and, you know, they're very curious about this. The way regulators are hardwired, they look at worst possible scenarios. They then monitor how widely used this is. And then there's a story that pops up about a $68 million acquisition of NFT in Singapore. So they probably are more than just academically interested. They're probably looking at potential risks, you know, how it impacts the customer that lives in Heartland, Toa Payoh, and, you know, things like that. But the good thing about the MES is that when it comes to financial services regulation, they do allow some, you know, degree of experimentation to happen out there. There has to be some level of materiality. In other words, is it widespread enough? Does it impact retail investors before they actually decide to regulate something? So materiality is important. Actually, it's a principle that the MD of MES has stated a few years ago during the FinTech Festival. That's one. The second principle is proportionality. So even if they do decide to regulate this, it has to be a proportionate measure that addresses specific risks. But remember that they've already decided to regulate, you know, cryptocurrencies and even fiat-backed tokens. They are now deemed to be digital payment tokens. I think a lot of guidance will also be taken from what the FATF says, because typically if the FATF says that regulate this, it will have a trickle-down effect on Singapore. So that again is another factor that's worth looking at. And remember that when we spoke about the FATF's position, it is unclear how they look at NFTs. They might think that it's not a virtual asset. And if that's the case, there is a chance it might not be regulated in Singapore. So I think things are still up in the air. A lot will depend on the incidence of fraud and scams. But I think there's also real value that NFTs can bring in terms of democratizing, you know, a lot of people in the creative industry, allowing them to monetize a lot of their work. So it is what we make out of it in the next couple of years, I think.
If I could just add to that, I mean, look, I totally agree with what Nizam just said. He's the guy I go to when I've got questions on regulatory. But going back to something that Rajesh pointed out earlier also, right, that about so much on this space is about trust, right? We talk about the fraud section and all. And, you know, obviously there's interest in Singapore and a number of other countries to be a hub for trading on currencies and, yeah, NFTs as well, within certain contexts, within certain rules. In a sense, Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, other widely used cryptocurrencies, widely traded cryptocurrencies, there's so much of it there that inherently there's some form of regulation. Otherwise, in order to build trust among its traders, its owners, otherwise people are not going to put money into it. NFT, because it is so unique, each of the NFTs is different. In a sense, there isn't that institutional regulatory framework for each NFT that's being issued. So actually, I think there's a lot of space whichever jurisdictions can come up with some rules to put some structure around NFT creation and trading. And I think a lot of issuers and traders or purchasers will then flock to that market. So I don't know how Singapore views itself on that. I leave it to wiser minds like Nizam and Rajesh to advise me on that. But whoever gets there first, it's going to have a fantastic market that they've just created.
Yeah, I see NFTs, you know, in the creative space in Singapore having a very significant part to play. At least from everything that I've been hearing so far, I'm not seeing any negativity coming across. There's a lot of positivity in the sense that, look, you know, this is a right that resonates very strongly with the position MES takes with regard to cryptocurrency as well, which is a fairly accommodating position, as opposed to let's be very, very careful and say no right off the bat. So, and that's really the approach in Singapore's the MES has taken with regard to NFTs to the extent that it may well be regulated. But let's take a step back from there and say, you know, looking at regulation for NFTs and ask, apart from the financial sector, What about the IP regime in Singapore? Will that accommodate NFT? What about the creative sector in Singapore? Or more importantly, the monetization of creative content for the region. Can Singapore potentially become a hub for that to happen? From a financing standpoint, and recognizing again that you're looking at NFTs not just from a monetization standpoint, but from a recordal standpoint, i.e., we become a place where you become the trusted hub for, or instead of having 20,000 different exchanges, Singapore becomes the place that you go to register your NFTs. I'm using register in a very loose sense, yeah, and then play that trust environment. I know we're all moving to a zero trust, but believe you me, trust is still an important asset for at the jurisdictional level, especially in nascent technology, and look at us playing that role. So question is, can Singapore play that kind of role? Does our legal environment allow for it to happen? The answer to both is yes and yes, meaning we have progressive regulators who are willing to really understand the issue, sit down with the players and say, look, how exactly does this work? What are the real risk factors? Can we address it regulatorily? Or if we can't, is the risk factor so low that as a society, we are willing to take it on? And that's what we did when it came to cryptocurrency. I wouldn't expect a different treatment for NFTs as well. I expect the same level of pragmatic approach being taken for NFTs as we have with virtual currency.
Okay, thank you. Going on, let's move on to the next question, right? So there's this, I think it's more of a comment coming from Janet, right? So saying that art can be duplicated, art on the blockchain can be duplicated and mean under different ownership and all that. So her comment is that it cannot prevent this from happening, right? So buyer abet emptor still applies. Any comments to this particular statement by Janet?
Yeah, I think we discussed it in the context of a fraud. So yes, it can happen. There have been instances where artists suddenly are surprised to see that their art pieces are, already NFT'd without their permission. So yeah, I mean, it's always buyer beware.
Okay. Now the next one is Bill. Bill once again wrote a very nice, I would say, a bit of a paragraph over there. So maybe the panelists can comment on what Bill actually written over here.
Yeah, I agree with Bill's thinking on this in terms of the fact that Singapore is a jurisdiction that will likely want to be helpful. So yeah, I think we're on the same page there. That MS is going to be on site with artists commercializing digital works, as Bill has very eloquently put it. I would expect that would be the case in Singapore, and I think we will want to play a facilitation role and also a hubbing role for the region. So I would be very surprised if our approach would be any different. And as of now, I have not seen anything from my experience to indicate any sort of alarm or undue concern on the part of the authorities with regard to NFTs. It's still very much, let's watch, wait, see how this develops. But because Singapore always looks at these things strategically, we will at the same time also be looking how can we leverage of this and become a hub and to promote the growth of this instrument through Singapore. So I think that will be the approach. So totally, I think Bill's points resonate very strongly with me.
For the rest of the guys, do you have anything to add on?
If I could add to Rajesh's point, in a sense, if you think about it, the use of NFTs for money laundering is there, it's real. But in a sense, because it's not fungible, there is some challenge, but some opportunities there as well. You would think that actually from maybe not an MAS, from a government of Singapore point of view, and frankly, all governments who have the bandwidth to think about this issue right now, I agree with Rajesh and Nizam that this is a huge opportunity. Right now, you have the likes of Sotheby's. Going back to the earlier question from Janet, for example, which she says that, and she rightly points out that is caveat emptor, which is why when you buy a piece of art from an institution like Sotheby's, might you still buy a piece of fraud? Of course, there is a possibility, but it's much lower as compared to buying, let's say, an auction house at iStart, right? I would trust Sotheby's more. So right now, you have a lot of artists, younger artists who are familiar with the environment, who are selling the pieces. what stops over time some of the more established artists, some of the Indonesian masters, for example, to then digitize their pieces and sell it? Now, where would they sell it? They would go to a jurisdiction and exchange that has that same reputation. So Bill's point is spot on. I think there's an opportunity there. It's very early days, and I think what Rajesh said, that from the government's point of view is look and see right now, but at the same time they're looking and seeing an opportunity, and I hope they do take it and let us build on it.
Actually, on that, I just realized that Bill had 2 paragraphs in his statement. On the first paragraph, I absolutely agree with what Bill said, but on the second paragraph, on the issue of data privacy, and on that because artists buy vanity names, etc., so they may have surrendered their privacy. I would still draw a distinction between your name as an artist and your personal data. I do not think that artists have to, by default, surrender privacy for the purpose of monetizing their content, nor should they be required to just because they're using an NFT. And on fractionalization and fractionalizing, I think that really depends on the sophistication of the artist and his or her manager managing the monetization of the content, if he so has one. And I would expect as NFTs mature and as the exchanges allow, for example, fractionalized NFTs to become a reality, then I would expect that artists will also be interested in that. But you're right, at this point, they're looking at it very much as a recordal exercise, just to say that, I've created this content, I'm sort of using this to record that I'm the one that actually created it, so no one else can go out there and create an NFT on it. That seems to be the narrative that I'm hearing a lot of today. We need to move them away from that recordal model to more of a monetization model in the longer term. So hopefully people will see both, but I'm seeing more of the recordal than the monetization models amongst artists as of now. That's just my view.
Okay. Probably moving on to the next one by Sean. I think it's another paragraph that I think Sean asked about as well. Okay, being unique and all that, right? Talking about due diligence, and I think the key question is that assume that NFT is traded on the Hong Kong exchange but brokered by Singapore traders. What are the applicable due diligence process, right? And also about what is actually defined as a compliant or acceptable structure procedure that our association or potentially the panelists can advise. So I think that's a question from Sean.
Okay, let me just take a crack at this. I think the question is, if you have a situation where you're going to trade an NFT on a Hong Kong platform, on an exchange, but brokered by Singapore traders, what's the applicable due diligence process? So it's not clear where the content creator is located as well, but let's just assume Singapore and Hong Kong. I think there are a multitude of issues that you need to consider. From a regulatory point of view, obviously, as we went through earlier on in the presentation, from a Singapore point of view, you need to assess whether these are deemed to be regulated particularly under the PSA. There might also, depending on how it's structured, you need to consider whether it's a securities arrangement or even a commodities transaction. We didn't really talk about that today. From a Hong Kong perspective, you also need to go through the exact same process. And then, of course, there are the other issues, what Rajesh covered about IP and other factors as well. I think happy to get my other fellow panelists to jump in.
Anyone want to add on to what Nizam said?
Yeah, if I can try to, Rajesh, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, I thought I was on mute. What I was saying that on the IP side is really what we've set out in the slides together, which is, you got to do your due diligence on the ownership aspects. And, like one of the persons I mentioned before, if IP is really a concern, then try and get both rights addressed at the same time when you're acquiring an interest. Both intellectual property, do your duty on the IP, ask where did this come from, is this taken from someone else, do your online searches. There are lots and lots of search engines available. So you're sure that underlying IP is truly owned by this person before the assignment happens. and then the NFT creation happens at the same time, transfer as it were. What we are seeing today, though, is that there are a lot of art pieces where there is no inherent NFT done as yet. So on that score, make sure that when you're acquiring the interest, there's no limitation with regards to your ability to create an NFT on the art piece, because that's now starting to slip into your standard licensing agreement from the creatives themselves. And I would expect that universities and the rest will start putting it into their standard templates. So then, people who buy without knowing that may actually, in fact, just be buying an intellectual property right without the ability to subsequently create an NFT on that, meaning you don't have that right. That right is reserved by the artist, yeah, in some cases. So do check on that from a duty standpoint.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, in a sense, that if it's brokered by the Singapore traders, it almost doesn't matter as much, because as Rajesh and Nizam have mentioned, it goes back to who the seller is, because that's the party that you want to enforce again. That's one. And two, what is it that you're actually buying? Now, I'm not as hard working over the weekend as Rajesh is, so I haven't tried to create an NFT and sell it. But if you have a look at the main websites, right, for OpenSea and Rarible and all, in terms of what you can actually put down, if you're actually selling it, as I understand it, you actually need to put down, or rather when you're buying it, right, there's actually an indication of what are you actually getting in terms of the code, and you get the short description of the NFT itself, as well as the link. Now, anything else that's actually attached to it, as far as I understand it, most of them actually there's very limited space for you to actually indicate that. There are some of the good examples like the clothing shop, clothing company I mentioned, but I think there's still fewer and far in between. But at this stage, bear in mind, it's a very early industry, right? So obviously standards and regular practice isn't there yet, but it will come, hopefully. And duty will over time hopefully become a more simplified process, but we're not there yet.
Okay. One more questions from, I suspect that's someone we know, right? Asman Hamid. So yeah, he wrote a long question. Nizam, maybe you want to look at it.
Congratulations, Asman, for staying this long in the webinar. No, it's almost 2 hours. Okay, your question is, and I agree that whether it's regulated depends whether it's deemed to be a DPT under the PSA, and that indirectly depends on whether it's virtual asset under the FATF guidance. Your question really is, if it's traded on an exchange, will that therefore bring in the elements of investability or means of exchange for goods or services under the PSA? And so whether listing on an exchange makes an NFT a DPT or a virtual asset. My view is that probably not, because fundamentally is still the same thing. So if I trade a vintage guitar, a Fender Stratocaster on an exchange, it doesn't make it a DPT. Even if I put a NFT on it, it's probably a thing, right? It is a right to a commodity. I don't think it necessarily becomes a DPT or securities, because by its nature, it's non-fungible. Somebody pays something for it, but it's not fungible. And therefore, I don't think it's going to satisfy the requirement of being able to be traded for goods or services. That's my view on it.
Any more comments from the rest on this particular topic?
Yeah, I'm taking the easy route and agreeing with Nizam on that. But if I can link back to the point about fractionalization, right? So I'm a very big fan of taking a big asset and splitting it up so that you have many owners and more people can benefit from it. I'm a big fan of that. But as Rajesh has pointed out, it then becomes a problem, because then you start running into all your securities regulations. Potentially, it gets there. So if you can then tread that middle ground of not being a DPT, not being some kind of security, but yet allowing more ownership, I think that's a great thing. I know that's not Asman's direct point, his point was that it was traded on an exchange, but I'm tying it to the point of if you then fractionalize it, say within a group. So not so much on an open exchange that anyone can access, but if you have literally a private members club that you don't have it's not any member of the public who can access it, there might be some potential so that there is some form of exchange, but it is not a DPT nor a security.
Okay. And looks like we have the final question over here from Sean again, right? So I think just to add on to his question, right? So I think maybe he's just asking for another comment on it.
That's an interesting one. The issue of, yeah, and I agree. It's, as I said, the virality of content that exists today creates a unique proposition for NFTs if we can get our act together and get these things registered quickly and efficiently. But who bears the cost of the duty process? It will have to be the acquiring party in first instance. And because certain content these days are created which are derivative, meaning it's made from other pieces, so your memes, etc., right? Take a certain photo and you write stuff on top of it and make it your own, or you take a certain theme and you try and copy it and make it your own in a different context. All of those means that the artists themselves also should bear some level of diligence on their part. The challenge here, as I always have when you talk to creatives, is that you are crimping my style. You are saying that, I need to censor myself when I create such content and think about who else owns it. I think we need to go beyond that. There's a difference between constraining yourself in terms of creativity and just copying. So if you know that you're just taking someone else's work and you're building off it, call a spade, do the duty. If you need to get a license from that person, go get a license from that person, build on it, and then go out there and monetize the NFT. So yes, the burden of duty and the cost will have to be borne by the creator of the NFT as well as the buyer of the NFT. Different types of due diligence, but they will have to bear it on their own.
I'm going to offer a slightly different answer from Rajesh. I think there's a business opportunity. If someone can come in, nobody wants to bear that cost, right? But if you can have a system that does that kind of work and spread out the costs around, it may not necessarily be the case that it is the buyer who needs to go and pay for that cost down the line.
Yeah, well worth considering that. Yeah, agree.
Let's have a chat after this, Choon.
You guys are the content creators, man. I'm a boring lawyer.
Okay, I think probably that answers that. Any more questions from anyone? Please feel free to type. I don't see that coming anymore. So I have a question, right, on the IP itself, which I didn't get answered, and that's something of a discussion. So there's this case of Decentraland, right? Discovered that, they do say that the IP rights and all that is actually belonging to any content creator. But if you look at the terms and all that, they discovered that, hey, they actually have another company called Metaverse Holdings, which defines as owning all the rights and IP of everything on the platform. So how does things like that, right, affect content creators, right? Because I think most of the time people do not read fine prints unless they have a legal advisor who kind of like advise them to do. But in this case, right, do they have all rights then, based on how they structure it, to all the content that the artists create, and then have rights to that, or actually the content creators would have a recourse in this case?
Yeah, I think the content creators need to be a bit smart again on this and choose your exchanges wisely. It's no different from the early days where people started putting stuff on Facebook and then realized, shock horror, in terms and conditions, you're basically giving Facebook all the rights over your photographs and your content and the rest of it. That's just the reality. They need the right to be able to display the content. So of course they need a right to use the content. So similarly for an exchange, when they need to list your content, your NFT, they need a right to list the content. But I think what needs to be distinguished is, specific rights from ownership rights. So you can give someone a right to do certain things with your IP without giving them ownership over the IP itself. And that's really what artists need to think about when it comes to NFTs. You need to give an exchange the right to list your NFTs, and they need to be able to do that. From you, you shouldn't dispute that. It'd be stupid for you because you can't sell your content otherwise. You need to give rights in an open manner, let's say, to the community to use your content, provided they don't themselves monetize it. And if they do, then there's residual interest that they need to share with you. So that ensures that people can use the content in an open manner. Remember, as I said from the start, the difference here is NFT resonates very, very well with the sharing economy that we're in today, right? So you're not trying to make money through scarcity, you're making money through prevalence and availability of the content out in the open. So have a more open, accepting model when it comes to use of your creative content by legitimate users. And then control the right to NFT. Yeah, the right to actually monetize, securitize the content. Those are rights that artists must very jealously guard moving forward. And so long as that is protected, I'm again looking at this purely from an NFT standpoint, then if what I say happens, which is, IP rights is not the dominant value proposition for content, but it is the inherent right over content itself, i.e. the token, that is the true value of content moving forward, then you've not lost anything in terms of people using the content, because that's not where the value is. The value is purely in the token. And so long as you've controlled and said that only I can tokenize this particular content, right, as an NFT, then you would have adequately protected. So we could move into a world where the licensing models actually become a lot simpler, because you're not controlling the use of the media anymore. You're just controlling the ownership over the media alone, which from a legal standpoint is actually a much simpler and cleaner construct than licensing models, which give me a lot of sleepless nights.
Okay, I think that's a very good satisfaction. I think that will also answer everyone's doubts on this case particular. I think people have read that before, right? So I think that will actually answer that as well. Okay, we've come to 6 o'clock, a very solid 2 hours. Thank you very much for the panelists for your time today. I think most of our audience will be very satisfied with, obviously there's too much topic to kind of like cover even in 2 hours, but I think we have covered most of the prominent topics that's actually been puzzling folks, in the market right now. So I think we can actually call it for a day. Thank you very much. Again, we are having a recording of this particular session. Look out for it when, on our YouTube channel, Blockchain Association of Singapore, and then leave us comments there if you want to. We also have a email, which is hello@blockchainassociation.org. So I think you can actually look for that, or you just Google for our website. You can actually find our contact list. If you have further questions, feel free to also leave questions to there. We'll try to answer you as soon as possible. Right. Again, thank you so much for everyone joining this. Look out for the next panel. We will be again covering a very different angle on NFT. Right. This time around, potentially, we are calling in the investors, those people who are willing to fork out $69 million to buy a piece of NFT, right? We'll try to get all folks like that, and it'll be pretty interesting to hear from their perspective. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.